The candle had burned down to a stub, its flickering light casting shadows that danced across the faces of the wounded men who filled every corner of the makeshift hospital. Sister Margaret Ashford had been awake for 43 hours, and the night was far from over. Her hands, steady despite the exhaustion that pressed against her bones like a physical weight, continued their work. Bandage, clean, comfort, repeat. She had learned long ago that sleep was a luxury reserved for those who had not taken an oath to heal, and in the autumn of 1854, in a converted monastery outside Scutari, luxuries did not exist. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Margaret had arrived in Turkey 3 weeks earlier, part of a contingent of 38 nurses recruited by Florence Nightingale to tend to British soldiers wounded in the Crimean War. She had been 26 years old then, a spinster by the standards of London society, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who had been horrified when she announced her intention to train as a nurse. Nursing was not a respectable profession for a woman of her class. It was work for the desperate, the poor, the fallen. But Margaret had been unmoved by her father's objections, by her mother's tears, by the scandalized whispers of their social circle. She had always known she was meant for something more than drawing-room conversations and needlepoint. Even as a child, she had been drawn to the suffering of others, bringing home injured birds and stray cats, much to her governess's dismay. She had read medical texts borrowed from her father's library, texts she wasn't supposed to have access to, texts that detailed anatomy and disease with a frankness that was considered inappropriate for young ladies. She had volunteered at charity hospitals in London's poorest districts, places where her fine dresses became stained with blood, and worse, places where she learned that compassion without skill was useless, that good intentions could not substitute for knowledge. When Miss Nightingale had published her call for nurses to serve in the war, Margaret had responded immediately. The interview had been rigorous. Florence Nightingale was not interested in romantic notions of nursing or in women who saw the mission as an adventure. She wanted serious, dedicated, morally upright women who understood that the work would be brutally hard, that the conditions would be appalling, that many of the men they tended would die despite their best efforts. Margaret had passed the interview. She had sailed from England with the others, crossing the Mediterranean in weather that left most of them violently seasick. She had arrived at Scutari to find conditions that exceeded her worst imaginings. The Barrack Hospital, as it was officially known, was a massive stone structure that had once housed Ottoman soldiers. Now it housed British wounded, thousands of them lying on the floor because there were not enough beds, wrapped in their own bloody uniforms because there were not enough blankets, dying from infections and disease at rates that exceeded battlefield casualties. The smell had hit her first. Blood and excrement and rotting flesh and unwashed bodies and something else. Something sweet and putrid that she would later learn was gangrene. The noise had come second. Moaning and crying and screaming and delirious ravings and the constant, horrible, wet coughing of men whose lungs were filling with fluid. The sight had come third, and it was the sight that had almost broken her. Men lying in their own filth. Men with wounds that had not been properly dressed in days. Men with limbs that needed amputation, but there were not enough surgeons. Men with fevers that raged unchecked. Men dying alone, calling for mothers and wives and God. Florence Nightingale had gathered her nurses that first night and told them plainly what they faced. The army medical system had collapsed under the weight of casualties. Supplies were inadequate, the doctors were overwhelmed, and many were incompetent or drunk or both. The orderlies were often soldiers who had been assigned the duty as punishment and who had no training and less interest in the welfare of the wounded. The death rate was catastrophic, not from wounds, but from disease and neglect. Cholera, typhus, dysentery. Infections that could have been prevented with basic sanitation. Their job, Miss Nightingale had said, was to bring order to chaos, to clean, to organize. to ensure the wounded received proper food and clean water and regular care, to comfort the dying and give them dignity in their final hours, to fight against a medical establishment that viewed nurses as interfering women who had no place in military hospitals, to prove through their work that professional nursing could save lives. Margaret had thrown herself into the work with a determination that bordered on obsession. While other nurses slept, she remained on the ward. While others took breaks, she continued working. She learned quickly, absorbing everything the more experienced nurses could teach her, watching the surgeons when they operated, reading medical texts by candlelight, in whatever spare moments she could find. She had a gift for the work. Her hands were gentle but efficient. Her presence calmed frightened men. Her voice, soft and steady, could reach through delirium and fever to provide comfort. But it was her refusal to sleep that set her apart, and eventually earned her the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life: the nurse who never slept. Men would wake in the night, disoriented and in pain, and there she would be, moving between the rows of wounded, checking bandages, offering water, adjusting blankets, holding the hand of a dying soldier so he wouldn't be alone. She became a fixture of the night shift, a constant presence in the gaslit wards where suffering seemed most acute. The truth, which Margaret kept to herself, was that she couldn't sleep. Not anymore. When she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the men she had failed to save. She heard their final words. She felt the exact moment when life left their bodies and they became still. Sleep brought nightmares that were worse than the reality of the wards. Dreams where she was drowning in blood, where all the wounded men rose up to accuse her of incompetence, where she watched helplessly as men died because she lacked the knowledge or skill to save them. So she stayed awake. She worked. She learned. She pushed her body past its limits and then past the limits beyond those limits. She sustained herself on tea and determination and the fierce belief that every life mattered, that every soldier deserved care and dignity regardless of rank or origin or the severity of his wounds. On this particular night, 43 hours into her current wakeful period, Margaret was tending to a young private named William Cooper. He had been brought in 2 days earlier with a bullet wound to the abdomen. The surgeon had operated, removing the bullet and doing what he could to repair the damage, but infection had set in. William was 19 years old, the son of a farmer from Yorkshire, and he was dying. His skin was gray and clammy. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His eyes, when they focused at all, held a mixture of pain and confusion. Margaret knelt beside his pallet, which was little more than a thin mattress on the stone floor. She had changed his bandages and given him water and a small dose of laudanum for the pain. Now she simply sat with him, holding his hand, because the doctor had told her there was nothing more to be done medically. William would likely not survive the night. "Am I going to die, sister?" William's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret could have lied. Many nurses did, offering false hope to spare the dying additional distress. But she had learned that dying men knew the truth, could sense it in the way nurses looked at them, in the particular gentleness that came when all medical interventions had been exhausted. And William deserved honesty. "I think you might be, William," she said softly. "But you're not alone. I'm here with you." Tears slipped down his face. "I'm scared." "I know, that's natural. Would it help to talk about home? About your family?" And so William talked, his words coming in fragments between labored breaths. He talked about his parents' farm, about the sheep they raised, about his younger sister who had cried when he enlisted. He talked about a girl named Emma who lived in the neighboring village, who he had been courting before the war, who he had hoped to marry when he returned. He talked about ordinary things, precious things, the fabric of a life that was ending before it had properly begun. Margaret listened, memorizing every word. She would write to William's parents after he died. She would tell them that their son had spoken of them at the end, that he had loved them, that he had not suffered unduly, that he had not died alone. It was a duty she had taken upon herself, writing these letters. The army would send an official notification, cold and impersonal. But Margaret believed families deserved more. They deserved to know that their sons and husbands and brothers had been cared for, had been treated with kindness, had been valued as individuals rather than as numbers in a casualty report. William died just before dawn, slipping away so quietly that Margaret almost didn't notice the transition. One moment he was breathing, the next he was still. She sat with him for several more minutes, her hand still holding his, unwilling to rush the moment. Death deserved acknowledgement, deserved respect. Then she gently closed his eyes, straightened his limbs, and pulled the blanket over his face. She made a note of the time and the details in the small journal she kept. Private William Cooper, 19th Regiment of Foot. Died 0400 hours, October 20th, 1854. Abdominal wound, infection, next of kin. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Cooper, Haworth, Yorkshire. She would write the letter later when she had time. For now there were other men who needed her attention. The ward was beginning to wake as dawn light filtered through the high windows. Men stirred, groaned, called out for water or for help. The day shift nurses would arrive soon, but until they did, Margaret continued her rounds. She had developed a system, a route through the ward, that allowed her to check on each man efficiently while ensuring none were overlooked. She knew their names, their injuries, their particular needs and quirks. She knew which ones needed extra blankets because fever made them shiver. She knew which ones needed less morphine because they had shown signs of dependency. She knew which ones were improving and which ones were failing. She was checking on a corporal with a leg wound when she felt the wave of dizziness hit. The ward tilted, and she had to grab the wall to steady herself. Her vision went dark at the edges, then cleared. Her heart was racing, pounding in her chest in a way that felt wrong. She took several deep breaths, willing her body to cooperate. Not now. Not here. There was too much work to be done. "Sister, are you well?" The corporal was looking at her with concern. "Perfectly well, thank you." Margaret forced a smile. "Just stood up too quickly. How is the leg this morning?" She finished her rounds through sheer force of will, though her body was screaming for rest. When the day shift nurses finally arrived, she gave them a detailed report on each patient's condition, on what treatments had been administered during the night, on which men needed particular attention. Then she made her way to the small room she shared with 3 other nurses. The room was barely large enough for 4 narrow beds and a single washstand. Her roommates were already asleep, exhausted from their own shifts. Margaret sat on her bed and unlaced her boots, which were stiff with dried blood. Her uniform was filthy, would need to be washed before her next shift. Her hands shook as she poured water into the basin and attempted to clean herself. The water turned pink, then red. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, but she could still feel the residue of death on her fingers. She should sleep. She knew she should sleep. Her body desperately needed rest, but when she lay down and closed her eyes, the nightmares came immediately. William Cooper's face accusing her. "Why didn't you save me?" Other faces crowded in. All the men who had died under her care. Dozens of them now. She could remember every single one. Their names, their stories, the exact moment of their deaths. Margaret's eyes snapped open. Her heart was pounding again, her breath coming in short gasps. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in. She couldn't stay here. She got up, pulled on her boots, and went back to the ward. There was always work to be done, always someone who needed help. If she couldn't sleep, she might as well be useful. Florence Nightingale found her there 3 hours later, changing the bandages of a soldier with burns covering half his body. The work required painstaking care, removing the old dressings without pulling away healing skin, cleaning the wounds with solutions that made the man whimper despite the morphine, applying fresh bandages impregnated with ointment. "Sister Ashford, a word please." Margaret finished securing the bandage before following Miss Nightingale to the small office that served as her command center. The room was cramped, filled with boxes of supplies, stacks of paperwork, and a desk piled high with correspondence. Miss Nightingale sat behind the desk and gestured for Margaret to take the single chair. "How long has it been since you properly slept?" Miss Nightingale's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "I slept this morning, Miss Nightingale." "For how long?" Margaret hesitated. "An hour, perhaps 2. And before that?" I'm not certain." "Sister Ashford, you are one of my most capable nurses. Your dedication is exemplary. But you are no good to these men if you collapse from exhaustion. I've been watching you and I've heard reports from the other nurses. You're working double shifts, sometimes triple. You're taking on additional duties when you should be resting. This cannot continue." Margaret felt a surge of panic. "Please don't remove me from duty. I can manage. I'm needed here." "You are needed here, which is precisely why I cannot allow you to burn yourself out. You will sleep a full 8 hours tonight. That is an order, not a suggestion. I will have one of the other nurses ensure you remain in your quarters." "But the men will be cared for by other capable nurses. We have a system precisely so that the work does not depend on any single person. If you were to fall ill, who would do your work then?" It was a valid point, one that Margaret could not argue against. She nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Miss Nightingale." "Good. Now, there's another matter I wish to discuss. I've been reviewing your work, your case notes, your letters to families. Your clinical observations are excellent. Have you ever considered pursuing formal medical training?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Women cannot train as physicians in England. Not yet, perhaps. But there are medical schools in other countries beginning to accept women. The United States has several. Switzerland has opened doors. If this war has taught us anything, it's that women are capable of far more than society has allowed. You have a gift for medicine, Sister Ashford. It would be a waste for you to not develop it fully. Margaret felt something stir inside her, something that might have been hope if she'd allowed herself to feel it. I never thought it possible. Start thinking it possible. We are living in changing times. The work we're doing here, the lives we're saving, will change how the world views nursing and women's capabilities. When this war ends, there will be opportunities. Be ready for them. The conversation stayed with Margaret as she reluctantly returned to her quarters that evening, as she lay in bed under the watchful eye of Sister Elizabeth, who had been assigned to ensure she slept. Medical school. Becoming a doctor. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. But Miss Nightingale was right. Things were changing. The nurses had proven themselves invaluable. They had reduced death rates through sanitation and organization. They had demonstrated that compassionate, skilled care made a measurable difference in outcomes. Despite her resistance, exhaustion finally overcame Margaret. She slept deeply for the first time in weeks, 10 hours of dreamless sleep that her body had desperately needed. When she woke, she felt clearer, stronger, more capable. She still carried the weight of all those deaths, still remembered every face. But she also remembered Miss Nightingale's words. She had a gift. She could develop it. She could do more. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Margaret still worked long hours, still pushed herself hard, but she made sure to sleep at least 6 hours in every 24. She ate regularly, forcing food down even when exhaustion had stolen her appetite. She took brief walks in the courtyard, breathing fresh air to cleanse her lungs of the ward's miasma. She began to read medical texts more systematically, studying surgical techniques and pharmacology and the treatment of infectious diseases. She also began to observe the doctors more carefully, not just watching their procedures but understanding their decision-making processes. Why did they choose one treatment over another? What signs and symptoms guided their diagnoses? How did they handle complications? She asked questions when the doctors seemed approachable, which many were not. The army surgeons were a mixed lot. Some were skilled and dedicated. Others were incompetent or indifferent or had taken military appointments because they had failed in civilian practice. But there were a few who recognized Margaret's intelligence and her genuine desire to learn. Dr. Matthews, a Scottish surgeon in his 50s, began to explain his procedures to her, to discuss cases and ask her opinion on treatment plans. He loaned her medical journals and books from his personal collection. He allowed her to assist in surgeries, to do more than simply hand him instruments, but to actually participate in the work. "You've got the hands for it," he told her one day after a particularly difficult amputation that Margaret had helped perform. "Steady, precise. And you've got the mind, too. You think like a physician. If you were a man, I'd be encouraging you to apply to medical school." "Miss Nightingale suggested I might seek training abroad," Margaret said, "in America or Switzerland." Dr. Matthews looked at her appraisingly. "You should. When this bloody war's over, you should do exactly that. The world needs good doctors, and gender shouldn't determine who gets to practice medicine." The war continued. Winter came, bringing new horrors. The cold in the hospital was brutal. Men who might have survived their wounds died from pneumonia and exposure. Supplies remained inadequate. Food was sometimes scarce. Disease continued to kill more soldiers than enemy bullets, but the nurses persisted, fighting death with the only weapons they had: cleanliness, organization, and compassionate care. Margaret developed a reputation not just among the nurses, but among the wounded soldiers themselves. Men requested her specifically when they were brought in. Her presence was calming, her touch was gentle, her medical knowledge was evident in the way she handled difficult cases, and her willingness to sit with the dying, to ensure no man left the world alone, was spoken of with reverence. "She's an angel," one soldier told another, loud enough for Margaret to hear as she passed. "Saw her last night, 3 in the morning, tending to Jackson. Held his hand while he went. Sang to him. Something soft. He smiled right before the end." Margaret didn't feel like an angel. She felt like someone doing necessary work that needed doing regardless of how hard it was. But she understood that the soldiers needed to believe in angels, needed to believe that someone cared about them as individuals, that their lives and deaths mattered. Christmas of 1854 came and went. The nurses did what they could to make it special for the wounded. They decorated the wards with what greenery they could find. They organized the delivery of special meals. They arranged for caroling. Margaret worked the overnight shift, moving through the wards with candles, checking on men, offering comfort, thinking about Christmases passed in her parents' London home. She wondered if her father had softened at all, if he might be proud of her work. She had written to her parents regularly, though their responses had been infrequent and cool. They had not forgiven her for what they saw as a disgrace to the family name, but Margaret had made her choice, and she could not regret it. This was where she belonged. This was the work she was meant to do. In January, a particularly bad outbreak of typhus swept through the hospital. Both patients and staff fell ill. 3 nurses died, including Sister Elizabeth, who had once watched over Margaret to ensure she slept. Margaret herself contracted the disease, though she tried to hide it and continue working. Her fever climbed, her body ached, she developed the characteristic rash. Finally, she collapsed while attempting to change a patient's bandages. She woke 3 days later in a bed in a separate ward where the sick nurses were quarantined. Miss Nightingale was there, sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading by candlelight. "Welcome back," Miss Nightingale said, setting aside her book. "You gave us quite a scare." Margaret tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. "The men, who's caring for them?" "Other nurses. The work continues, as it always does. You need to rest and recover. I can't just lie here." "You can and you will. Doctor's orders. My orders. You're no good to anyone dead, Sister Ashford." It was the longest week of Margaret's life. Being a patient rather than a nurse, being helpless rather than helpful, went against everything in her nature. But her body was weak, depleted by illness and months of overwork. She had no choice but to rest, to allow others to care for her, to focus on recovery. During that enforced rest, she had time to think, to really think, not just react to the immediate demands of each moment. She thought about what she had learned over the past months, about medicine and nursing and the difference between the two, about the limitations of nursing, however skilled. Nurses could provide excellent care, but they could not diagnose, could not prescribe, could not perform surgery. Those decisions remained with doctors, and too many doctors were incompetent or careless or both. She thought about William Cooper and all the others who had died. How many might have lived with better medical care? How many had been killed by infection that could have been prevented? How many had undergone amputations that might not have been necessary if the initial wound had been treated properly? The questions haunted her, drove her. When she finally recovered enough to return to work, she did so with renewed purpose. She would learn everything she could hear, absorb every bit of medical knowledge available to her, and when the war ended, she would pursue formal medical training. She would become the kind of doctor she wished had been treating her patients. Skilled, knowledgeable, compassionate. Someone who saw patients as people rather than cases. Spring brought a shift in the war. The siege of Sevastopol continued, but the immediate crisis at Scutari had eased somewhat. The death rate had dropped significantly thanks to the sanitation reforms Miss Nightingale had implemented. Supplies had improved. More competent doctors had been sent out. The hospital began to feel less like a charnel house and more like an actual medical facility. Margaret's reputation continued to grow. When particularly difficult cases came in, doctors would ask for her assistance. When families wrote requesting information about their wounded relatives, Miss Nightingale often had Margaret respond because her letters were detailed and compassionate. When new nurses arrived, Margaret was assigned to train them, to pass on the knowledge and skills she had acquired. But she still worked nights whenever possible. The nighttime hours remained her domain, the time when she felt most useful, most needed. The darkness held fewer terrors now. She had learned to function on limited sleep, had trained her body to survive on 4 or 5 hours and be alert and capable. It wasn't healthy, she knew. Dr. Matthews warned her regularly about burning out, but she couldn't seem to help herself. Sleep still brought nightmares, and work was her refuge from them. On a night in late April, Margaret was tending to a newly arrived patient, a young officer who had been badly wounded in a cavalry charge. His name was Captain Richard Ashworth, and his right arm had been shattered by a cannonball. Dr. Matthews had amputated earlier in the day, and now Margaret was monitoring him for signs of shock or infection. Captain Ashworth was conscious but clearly in pain despite the morphine. He was trying to maintain a stiff upper lip, the British officer's creed of not showing weakness, but Margaret could see the fear in his eyes. Amputation was terrifying. The loss of a limb meant the loss of military career, often the loss of livelihood, a fundamental change in how one moved through the world. "It hurts," he said finally, abandoning the pretense of stoicism. "I know, the morphine should help, but it takes time. Would you like me to increase the dose?" "No, I need to think clearly, to plan. My career is over. I need to figure out what comes next." "There's time for that later," Margaret said gently. "Right now, focus on healing. The rest will sort itself out." "Will it? I'm a soldier. It's all I've ever been." What use is a one-armed soldier? Margaret had heard variations of this conversation many times. Men whose identities were wrapped up in physical capability, who couldn't imagine themselves as anything other than what they had been. She had learned that platitudes didn't help. Honesty did. "You're right that your army career is likely finished," she said. "That's a real loss, and it's natural to grieve it. But you're more than just a soldier. You're an educated man. You can read and write and think. There are many paths available to you, even with one arm. I've known men who lost limbs and went on to become teachers, clerks, administrators, business owners. Your life isn't over. It's changed, certainly, but it's not over." Captain Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. "You're quite direct, sister. I find that false reassurance helps no one, but truthful reassurance, that can make a difference." Over the following days, Margaret tended to Captain Ashworth regularly. She changed his bandages, managed his pain, watched for signs of infection. She also talked with him, drawing him out about his life before the army, his interests, his dreams beyond military service. Slowly she watched him shift from despair to acceptance to cautious hope. "You should be a doctor," he told her one evening. "You have the skills for it, certainly, and the manner. You don't coddle, but you care. That's rare. Women cannot be doctors in England. Then England is foolish." Have you considered going elsewhere? I know there are medical schools in America that accept women. I have considered it. When the war ends, I plan to pursue it. Good. The world needs more doctors, like you would be. The conversation stayed with Margaret. Captain Ashworth was the third person to suggest she pursue formal medical training. First Miss Nightingale, then Dr. Matthews, now a patient. Perhaps the universe was trying to tell her something. Perhaps this was indeed her path forward. Summer came. The war continued, but its character had changed. The siege of Sevastopol finally ended with Russian withdrawal. Casualties continued, but at a reduced rate. There was talk that the war might be winding down, though no one knew for certain. At Scutari, the hospital population decreased, as wounded men either recovered enough to return to duty or were invalided home to England. Margaret used the relative lull to deepen her medical studies. She read everything she could find on anatomy, physiology, pathology, surgery. She assisted in more operations, learning surgical techniques. She studied pharmacology, learning which medications worked for which conditions, understanding dosing and contraindications. She kept detailed case notes on every patient she treated, tracking outcomes, trying to identify patterns. Dr. Matthews noticed her systematic approach. "You're conducting research," he observed one day, looking through her notes. "I suppose I am. I want to understand what works and what doesn't, why some patients recover and others don't, whether there are interventions we're missing. That's how good medicine advances, through careful observation and analysis. Have you thought about publishing your findings?" Margaret was startled. "Publishing? I'm not a doctor. Who would take seriously the observations of a nurse? Anyone with sense would. Your notes are as good as anything I've seen from qualified physicians. Better than most, actually. You should consider writing them up for medical journals." The idea was both exciting and daunting, but Margaret began to think seriously about it. She selected several cases where she had particularly detailed observations and began writing them up in formal case study format. She documented symptoms, treatments, outcomes. She offered analysis and suggestions for improved care. The work was painstaking, requiring her to find time between shifts to write and revise. When she finally showed the finished papers to Dr. Matthews, he read them carefully and then smiled. "These are excellent, genuinely excellent. I have contacts at several medical journals. May I submit these on your behalf? Would they publish work by a woman? They might, if the work is good enough, and this is, we'll see." News of the war's end came in February of 1856. The Treaty of Paris was signed, bringing the Crimean War to a close. At Scutari, the announcement was met with mixed emotions, relief that the killing would stop, sadness for all that had been lost, uncertainty about what came next. For Margaret, it meant a decision. Would she return to England, or would she pursue her dream of medical school? Miss Nightingale made the decision easier. She had secured funding to establish a training school for nurses in London, and she wanted Margaret to help found it, to serve as an instructor. It was a tremendous opportunity, a chance to shape the future of nursing education. But it would also mean staying in England, putting medical school on hold indefinitely. Margaret struggled with the choice. Both paths offered the chance to heal, to help, to advance medical care. But they were fundamentally different paths. Nursing education versus medical practice, teaching versus treating. In the end, it was a letter that decided things. A letter from Dr. Matthews containing extraordinary news. One of her case studies had been accepted for publication in the prestigious British Medical Journal. Moreover, the journal's editors were so impressed with her work that they had included a note encouraging her to pursue formal medical training and offering to publish more of her research. The letter also contained news from America. Dr. Matthews had written to colleagues at the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, describing Margaret's work and abilities. They had responded with an invitation. If she wished to apply for admission, her application would be given serious consideration based on her demonstrated clinical experience and publications. Margaret read the letter 3 times, hardly daring to believe it. Medical school, real medical training, the chance to become the kind of doctor she had dreamed of being. But it would mean leaving England, leaving everything familiar, starting over in a foreign country. She discussed it with Miss Nightingale, who listened carefully and then gave her blessing. "You must follow your calling, Sister Ashford. Nursing needs you certainly, but if your calling is to medicine, then that is where you should go. We will miss you terribly, but we will also be proud of you." She wrote to her parents, informing them of her decision. Their response was predictably cold. They could not support such an outrageous plan. A woman doctor was an abomination, a violation of natural law and divine order. They would not provide financial assistance. They would not give their blessing. If she pursued this path, she would do so alone and unsupported. Margaret had expected nothing different, and she had prepared for it. Over her time at Scutari, she had saved most of her salary, having little opportunity to spend it. She had also received small payments for her published case studies. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get her to Philadelphia and sustain her through the first term while she looked for additional work. Captain Ashworth, who had recovered and was preparing to return to England, heard of her plans and surprised her with an offer. He came from a wealthy family and he insisted on contributing to her medical education as thanks for her care. He wouldn't take no for an answer. The donation he made was generous enough to cover her entire first year of expenses. "You saved my life and gave me hope when I had none," he said. "This is inadequate repayment, but please accept it in the spirit it's offered." Margaret accepted, moved by his generosity. With this support, medical school became not just a dream, but a genuine possibility. She left Scutari in March of 1856, sailing back to England with Miss Nightingale and the other nurses. London seemed strange after 18 months in Turkey. Too clean, too orderly, too peaceful. She spent a few weeks helping establish the nurse training school, sharing her knowledge with the first class of students, then began preparations for her journey to America. Her parents refused to see her before she left. It hurt, but Margaret had accepted that her choices had consequences. She was choosing a path that would lead away from everything society expected of a woman of her class. But it was her path, the one she was meant to walk. She sailed for America in May, crossing the Atlantic with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Philadelphia was hot and humid when she arrived, so different from London. The female medical college was smaller than she had imagined, housed in a modest building, operating on a limited budget, but the faculty were dedicated and the students were serious. Women who had overcome tremendous obstacles to pursue medical education. Margaret threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had brought to nursing. Anatomy, chemistry, physiology, pathology, materia medica, clinical practice. The work was demanding, requiring long hours of study and memorization, but she loved it. This was what she had been working toward, preparing for, dreaming about. She quickly distinguished herself in her classes. Her clinical experience gave her advantages over students who had never treated patients. She could recognize symptoms that others missed. She understood the progression of diseases from direct observation. She had practical skills that most medical students only acquired during their final years. But she also faced obstacles. Some of her professors were openly skeptical of women in medicine. Some of her clinical rotations placed her in hospitals where staff refused to work with female students. Some patients refused treatment from a woman doctor. The discrimination was constant, exhausting, demoralizing. Margaret persisted. She worked harder than her male counterparts, knowing she had to be better just to be considered equal. She took on extra shifts. She volunteered for the most difficult cases. She published more case studies and research papers, building a reputation in medical circles as a serious scholar and talented clinician. Sleep remained elusive. The patterns she had developed at Scutari persisted. She studied late into the night, running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. She took overnight shifts at the charity hospital where she did her clinical training. Her classmates and professors worried about her, but Margaret couldn't seem to change. Work was still her refuge. Still the thing that gave her life meaning and purpose. In her second year, she began to specialize in surgery and obstetrics. These were fields where women doctors could make particular contributions, where female patients often preferred female practitioners. She studied under Dr. Emmeline Cleveland, one of the first women to perform ovariotomies in America, learning advanced surgical techniques. She also began to write more extensively, not just case studies, but articles on medical education for women, on the benefits of female physicians in treating female patients, on reforms needed in hospital practice. Her writing was clear and forceful, backed by clinical evidence and logical argument. Some publications rejected her submissions out of hand because of her gender, but others, impressed by the quality of her work, published her articles. Graduation came in 1859. Margaret received her medical degree with highest honors, becoming Dr. Margaret Ashford. Her parents did not attend the ceremony. None of her family did. But she had created a new family among her fellow students and supportive faculty. And she had letters of congratulation from Miss Nightingale, from Dr. Matthews, from Captain Ashworth, from many of the nurses she had worked with at Scutari. She established her practice in Philadelphia, specializing in women's health and surgery. The early years were difficult. Many people refused to see a woman doctor. Some colleagues refused to refer patients to her. Some hospitals refused to grant her admitting privileges. But slowly, patient by patient, case by case, she built a reputation. Women who had been dismissed or poorly treated by male physicians found in her a doctor who listened, who understood, who provided competent care with compassion. She also continued her research, publishing papers on puerperal fever, on surgical techniques for treating ovarian tumors, on the management of difficult childbirths. Her work was increasingly cited by other physicians. She was invited to speak at medical conferences, though she often faced hostility and condescension from male colleagues who resented her presence. When the American Civil War began in 1861, Margaret immediately volunteered her services. She had experience treating war wounded, and she knew she could help. She was appointed as a contract surgeon, one of the few women to hold such a position, and sent to field hospitals in Virginia. The experience was both familiar and strange. Familiar because the wounds and diseases were the same as she had seen in Crimea. Strange because this time she was the doctor, the one making decisions about treatment, performing surgeries, managing entire wards of patients. The responsibility was enormous, but she had been preparing for it for years. She worked the same brutal hours she had worked as a nurse at Scutari. Minimal sleep, maximum effort. Patients came first, always. Her skill became legendary among the wounded soldiers. Men requested assignment to the hospital where Dr. Ashford worked. Her surgical outcomes were better than most of her male colleagues. Her post-operative care was meticulous. Her ability to manage complications was exceptional, but the old patterns reasserted themselves too. The refusal to sleep more than a few hours, the nightmares when she did sleep, the faces of the dead haunting her, the weight of responsibility that never lifted. She was older now, in her 30s, and her body could not sustain the abuse as well as it had when she was younger. She developed chronic headaches. Her hands sometimes trembled. She lost weight because she forgot to eat. A colleague, Dr. Samuel Richardson, noticed and confronted her. "Margaret, you're killing yourself. You can't maintain this pace. The men need care. I can provide it. And when you collapse from exhaustion, who will care for them then? You're an excellent doctor precisely because you care so much. But that same quality is destroying you. You have to learn to set limits, to take care of yourself, so you can take care of others." It was an echo of what Miss Nightingale had told her years ago at Scutari. Margaret knew it was true, but knowing and doing were different things. She had built her entire adult life around service, around putting others first, around working past exhaustion to help one more person. How did you stop doing that? How did you learn to rest when rest felt like abandonment? The answer came unexpectedly through a patient, a young woman named Sarah, who had been caught in crossfire and brought to the hospital with a severe abdominal wound. Margaret operated, spending 6 hours carefully repairing damage to intestines and blood vessels. The surgery was successful, but Sarah developed an infection post-operatively. For 3 days, Margaret barely left her bedside, trying every treatment she knew to fight the sepsis. Sarah died on the 4th day, and Margaret was devastated. She had done everything right. The surgery had been technically perfect. The post-operative care had been meticulous, but sometimes medicine wasn't enough. Sometimes people died despite your best efforts. Margaret found herself unable to move on to the next patient. She sat in the empty surgery staring at nothing, feeling the weight of every death she had witnessed over the past decade. William Cooper at Scutari, Sister Elizabeth who died of typhus, Captain Morrison who bled out during an amputation she couldn't stop, Sarah with her infection that no treatment could cure, hundreds of others, all their faces, all their names, all the guilt of not being able to save them. Dr. Richardson found her there. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her. After a long silence, Margaret spoke. "I can't do this anymore, Samuel. I can't watch another person die." "Then don't. Take a leave. Go somewhere peaceful. Rest. Heal. Come back when you're ready. And if I'm never ready, then you've given enough. More than enough. No one could ask more of you than you've already given." Margaret took the leave. She went to a small town in upstate New York, far from the war, far from hospitals and suffering. She rented a room in a boarding house, and for the first time in her adult life, she did nothing. She slept. She walked. She read novels instead of medical texts. She sat in gardens and watched birds. She allowed herself to simply be rather than constantly do. The nightmares persisted at first, but gradually they began to fade. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming less frequent, less intense. She found that when she slept 8 or 9 hours instead of 4 or 5, her headaches diminished. Her hands stopped trembling. She gained back the weight she had lost. Her mind, which had been in a constant state of exhausted alertness, began to clear. She thought about her life, about the choices she had made, about what she wanted moving forward. She realized that she had been running from something for years, running from the pain of loss by never allowing herself to stop and feel it, running from her own limitations by pushing past them constantly, running from the reality that she was human, finite, capable of being depleted. She thought about her nickname from Scutari, the nurse who never slept. She had worn it with pride then, proof of her dedication and endurance. But now she understood it differently. It was a symptom, not a virtue, a sign of someone who couldn't allow herself to be vulnerable, to admit weakness, to rest and recover. After 3 months, Margaret felt ready to return to medicine. But she returned differently. She set reasonable hours for her practice. She hired an associate physician to share the workload. She made sure she slept adequately and ate regularly. She allowed herself days off, time to rest and recover. Most radically, she accepted that she couldn't save everyone, that some patients would die despite her best efforts, and that their deaths were not failures of her skill or dedication, but simply the inevitable reality of human mortality. She returned to Philadelphia after the war ended and resumed her practice there. She continued to specialize in women's health, but she also began teaching at the Female Medical College, training the next generation of women physicians. She published a book on obstetric surgery that became a standard text. She advocated for reforms in medical education and hospital practice. She mentored young women doctors, helping them navigate the obstacles she had faced. She never married, though she had opportunities. Her work remained central to her identity and purpose, but she also developed friendships, hobbies, interests outside of medicine. She joined a literary society. She took up painting. She traveled for pleasure rather than only for professional conferences. She learned slowly and imperfectly to be a whole person rather than just a doctor. In her 60s, looking back on her life, Margaret could see the arc of it clearly. The passionate young woman who had defied her family to become a nurse. The driven student who had pushed herself to exhaustion in pursuit of medical knowledge. The skilled surgeon who had saved countless lives. The teacher and mentor who had opened doors for others. The writer and advocate who had advanced the cause of women in medicine. But she could also see the cost, the relationships she had sacrificed, the years lost to overwork and exhaustion, the trauma she had carried for so long before learning to address it, the nickname that had once seemed like a badge of honor, but was really a warning sign. If she could speak to her younger self, what would she say? Work hard, yes. Care deeply, yes. But also rest, also heal. Also remember that you cannot pour from an empty cup, that self-sacrifice is not the same as service. that taking care of yourself enables you to better care for others. The irony was that she had told patients this for years. Rest is part of healing. You must take care of yourself. But she had not applied the same wisdom to herself. It had taken complete exhaustion and the edge of breakdown before she learned the lesson. She hoped the young doctors she mentored would learn it earlier than she had. Margaret Ashford died in 1896 at the age of 68, still practicing medicine, still teaching, still advocating for women physicians. Her obituaries noted her contributions to surgery, her role in advancing women's medical education, her service during 2 wars. Some mentioned her old nickname, the nurse who never slept. But those who had known her well, who had seen her transformation in her middle years, understood that her greatest achievement was not her endurance or her refusal to rest. It was her wisdom in learning when to stop, when to heal, when to acknowledge her own humanity. She had been a pioneer in women's medicine, yes, but she had also been a pioneer in understanding that caring for oneself was not selfish, but necessary. That rest was not weakness, but strength, that you could be both dedicated and human. Her legacy lived on in the doctors she trained, in the patients she treated, in the reforms she championed. But perhaps her truest legacy was the lesson she learned and taught, that the best healers are those who understand their own need for healing, that sustainable service requires sustainable self-care, and that there is no virtue in destroying yourself in the service of others. The candle that had illuminated her first night at Scutari had long since burned out. But the light of her work, her wisdom, her example continued to shine, guiding others toward a more balanced, more humane approach to medicine and to life.